And I'm going to share screen. And I'm going to get this up. And okay, y'all can see. I, I have just been struck. I mean, things in Ukraine and things in Russia are just so crazy. But I've been really struck at what's going on in China and Japan, which I think may hold the key. Right? They're the real superpowers economically, and Russia is a pipsqueak compared to them. And Russia's days are numbered as they've got everything based on petrochemicals. And the long-term prospect of that is not that great. Let's do a quick update on Ukraine. Hold on, we got feedback. Heiko? No, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay, good.
We still got feedback somewhere.
Well, just make sure you're off. Yeah.
It's still hearing me.
Okay, wait. Just let me.
I shouldn't have said yes. We need to mute.
Okay, here's me.
Sorry, folks.
It's gone now.
All good.
Okay. So you'll remember Margarita Simonyan. So where was she during the Great Mutiny? This is interesting. So you remember Margarita. I'm just going to do a few slides to refresh your memory. She's been the head of Russian TV since the age of 25. And she, what happened there? Something bad. So are you seeing that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so hello, Carol.
Yeah, great. Hi. Sorry I was late.
No problem. She's been a real hawk, and she's been urging Putin to bomb infrastructure and civilians and even nuclear power plants. She pushed the idea of referendum. And then 6 weeks ago, she had a change of heart, you might remember. So, Ukraine's too strong. They don't want us. Who wants them? Freeze the war and negotiate. So where was she during the Great Mutiny? She was silent. She was on a cruise and did not weigh in for a long time. And when she did, the Kremlin cheerleaders are dismissing it and searching for normality. And that's really ironic because you'll remember when we first met her, she had warned the way that the mobilization was going and that was so heavy-handed. She had warned about a possible mutiny, and that was her words. Well, she was prescient. So the intrigue in Russia goes on. I'm not. It's history. Not quite. It's current events, and I'm trying to stick to history. Otherwise, we'll be forever distracted. So what I'm interested in this week is the history of China and Japan and how this relates to Russia and how is how did the Chinese respond to the mutiny? And this is a nationalistic journalist who was first out of the blocks, and he said, Russia's never going to be the country it was. So, but apparently that comment was too high profile, and it was quickly deleted, and he's been keeping a low profile ever since. But he predicted in his initial response that the outcome for Prigozhin was going to be tragic. So this is my bridge to China, because I do think they certainly hold the long-term key, and secondarily that brings in Japan, and we have a number of our attendees who have some kind of special interest in Japan. I don't know why. You'll remember she made this interesting statement with Putin standing by, saying that you and I together are going to make changes that haven't been seen for 100 years. That sure got my attention. What the heck have these guys been thinking about? We know that Putin is a big history buff, and he's come up with these crazy histories that show that Ukraine doesn't exist. What does she think? So she is kind of endorsing what Putin has said, that the biggest tragedy of the last century was the fall of the Russian Empire, and secondarily the fall of the Soviet states. And what is she talking about? China 100 years ago was the birth of the Communist Party in China in the 1920s. He's been influenced by what's been going on in Ukraine and how poorly Putin is keeping his end of the bargain to make changes worthy of 100 years. And there was a leak last week where the Chinese wanted to be known in the West that Xi Jinping has advised Putin to stop talking about nuclear military intervention. And this is all private, but just leaks. Hey, Xi said this, and he's not going to say it in public, but he's cooling Putin down. So they're kind of playing good cop, bad cop. Anyway, Beijing is beginning to have second thoughts, apparently. I mean, we'll see, but it's a tantalizing thing, which just leads me to look at China's overall strategy. We've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months talking about China. We bought Ramsey in to look at the New World Order after World War II. The Economist came out with a special report on what does China want. We've done a pretty deep dive on that background. And so I think it's worthwhile to look at what China is doing now, following up on what we've studied previously. And they are appealing to the global South. We're all kind of surprised at the global South, the countries in the developing world, balking at our criticism of Russia and their invasion. One notable exception was the ambassador to the United Nations from Kenya saying, hey, look, you're trying to change international borders. If African countries went back to trying to find their original borders, it would be chaos, and you shouldn't do that. But any support that Putin has seems to be coming from the global South, China is fanning the flames to blame America for what has gone on in Ukraine, that we set up the NATO involvement and have encouraged Ukraine to punch the Russian bear. But China is playing a dangerous game. They need the West. We know they do. You guys got to look, unfortunately, on that screen somehow. We haven't, unless you can get it up. We could try to get it up on the big screen. And so try plugging that in, see what happens. Okay. Wait, 1 second. Hold on, I got to do one more. Do it quite yet. Okay, we're experimenting here to see if we can get it up on the big screen. That doesn't look like we're going to. I'll be darned. We got it up on the big screen here. So we've got a large audience live in the studio, 4 people setting a new record. It's multi-generational, folks. Excuse my interjecting a personal thing. I've got a son and a grandson, and always, and of course, always Rudy, our faithful next door neighbor. China's playing a dangerous game. They're trying to walk both sides of the street. They need our trade for sure. The West, we've been treating Ukraine, and I have certainly, the invasion as one of the worst emergencies of the century. I've been using the phrase a hinge point of history. I noticed Biden is constantly saying it's an inflection point. So he certainly is thinking the way that a lot of us are thinking. This is really reshuffling the deck big time. And African leaders, people from the global South, are accusing us of a double standard. So they're saying that they watch us take Ukraine refugees into our homes, and they say, well, where were you? Where was the West during all our famines and all the disasters that we've had? How's come we didn't get this outpouring in united response that has brought America and the EU together? How's come they didn't do that for us? How's come they didn't do that for COVID? China has actually been surprised at the global South, that on their own initiative, they've kind of turned their back on America. So they're piling on, and they can see an opportunity here. That the rest of the global South is so indifferent to the plight of Ukraine. They're seeing they can leverage that and turn the 21st century into the Asian century. And so I thought that was important. And then you see the spin coming out of Chinese commentators like the former ambassador to Washington, and he accuses the West and the United States of hegemonic arrogance and this idea of civilizational superiority, and that even our talk about the Ukrainians, the brave Ukrainians fighting to the end, he sees, well, hey, is that genocide? That's kind of twisting things a little bit, but this is the kind of mentality that the world is suffering under now. And he even says America's policy to Ukraine is heartless because instead of encouraging negotiation, and I certainly I am guilty of this, rooting for Ukraine to push the Russians into the Azov Sea. And so recently, in this vein, there was a peace mission to Ukraine by leaders from Africa, from South Africa and other places. And in those meetings, you can see things didn't go well with Zelensky. They took this point of view, and Zelensky was a little bit irritated. Hey, they've taken over 20% of my country. What leader in Africa is going to tolerate that? And then they went on to Moscow and made nice with Putin. And they talked about how the Ukraine war has created high food prices for them. And they didn't think that they were treated fairly on their tour through Ukraine. So we got a real public relations problem. And interesting enough, this builds on an initiative that Xi has recently launched, touting Chinese global civilization as a global civilization, and pointing out that China is a great alternative, that you don't have to westernize to modernize. You can follow the Chinese model. And this rules-based order that the West is trying to build off, the one that was created at the end of World War II by the Bretton Woods, as Ramsey laid out so well, that rules-based order may be just a product of Western chauvinism. So that our preaching about a world order is like the missionaries that came into African countries and gave the Africans a new god to worship. So they're pulling out all the propaganda stops. She goes on to assert that Chinese civilization has been upheld as a way of peace for 5,000 years. And he points out that the character, and I'll nod to our people in the audience that know kanji, that the character for peace is a rice stalk and a mouth. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm giving from the studio audience a nod of the head that this is a rice stalk and a mouth.
Your peace.
And that's peace. And China's making the point, hey, peace is inseparable from food security, and this war in Ukraine is cutting off the flow of wheat, conveniently ignoring the fact that it's Russia who is controlling the Black Sea and making that happen. And he goes on to say that peace is in China's DNA. This anticipates, I hope, something that you'll want me to go on and talk about at a future meeting, which what is the DNA in East Asia? What is truly uniquely Chinese, Korean, and Japanese? And the results will surprise you. I'm just saying, I'm just teasing a little bit, hoping that we'll go in that direction. But we know that China has the interest of the Communist Party first, state power, and at the expense of individual rights. And that goes against our Enlightenment. It certainly goes against the American Revolution and the French Revolution, for that matter. But the need for universal security is more important than universal rights in their eyes. And this is a separate article that came out a while ago, an analysis that says what Xi is doing with his propaganda is he's following into the legitimacy trap. That China, the Communist Party, is in danger of losing their legitimacy because they're failing to deliver on economic prosperity. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, all the points where they're failing, including the dropping of the population, which is some measure of the health of a civilization. And so he's resorted to reaching into Chinese ancient history to legitimize his communist government. So it's just an interesting stretch. So I'd like to just take a closer look at that. She is claiming that it's China that's the exceptional country because of this 5,000 years of uninterrupted rule. Well, we'll see. He's extrapolating this argument. It said every country should follow its own path and not follow the West. There's more than one way to modernize. And by the way, because we have such a great civilization, I have every right to integrate our whole nation, including Tibet and Xinjiang, and Taiwan, into this wonderful 5,000-year-old civilization. Well, here's the reality. And I put together this graphic when Ramsey led us through the Chinese dynasties. It's like, well, wait a second. There are long periods of disunity, especially between the Han and the Tang dynasty. There were 400 years of disunity. And then between the Tang and the Song, 53, 89. And then there was 38 years in my lifetime of disunity between the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Communist Party. And it's interesting, this conceptualization of it, because Kissinger conceptualized the Chinese rule, the communist rule, as being basically another dynasty with the continuity of Confucian thought. And he raised this to Zhou Enlai in 1972 with the whole Nixon breakthrough. And Zhou Enlai got really mad because the interpreter that was in the room was a spy from Mao's wife, who thought that Zhou Enlai was a secret Confucianist. Oh boy. Here you have the odd spectacle of the Communist Party, a revolutionary party touting itself as the faithful inheritor of all these dynasties going back 5,000 years. And it's as big a stretch as Putin's history of Ukraine. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so we're in a very perilous moment. And China is saying if we don't follow our 5,000-year-old history, we would be betraying every dynasty. So that's quite a historical mandate. So The Economist says, look, this rebellion of the global South, we're just paying the price for what they're saying. We have ignored them. We didn't put them at the top of the list when it came to COVID relief. But it is important that our Enlightenment values that are a couple of hundred years old and were endorsed in 1945 with the post Bretton Woods order, which is certainly struggling, but the values of transparent rule, of free speech, of independent courts and accountability, checks and balances, being mindful of the accumulation of power. That's a public good, and the public benefits and should give its consent. And we can see in China when that wasn't true. Mao got all the power, and you got the Cultural Revolution, and the schools, universities closed for 15 years. And that's what happens. That's the danger. And this is the sort of thing that the post-World War II order was going to prevent. And I just pointed out what the problem is for the global South, but China makes the point, hey, the global South, you can object all you want because you didn't even exist until the fall of colonialism in the 60s. The post in 1945, you weren't even on the map. The interesting thing, and this is, Tim lived a couple of years in Brazil. Dilma Rousseff, who was who succeeded Lula, is now the president of a new development bank. And this is the BRICS Bank. What's BRICS? BRIC, with an S for South Africa, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And so we're talking about a group of countries that are one step above being underdeveloped. But they're piling on the global South. And Dilma Rousseff, who was a friend of the United States, as was Lula, is now accusing the global North of hoarding the wealth, of trying to contain China, well, guilty as charged, and dismissing diversity, which is, she seems to be arguing for tolerating what we see as the rising string of strongmen. This is the kind of diversity where the autocrats, this is what we're supposed to tolerate. And she condemns the United States' use of sanctions even. So I want to focus a second. I've mentioned Japan, and since we have a strong Japanese contingent here, I want to point out that Japan's aid for Ukraine is second only to Canada as non-European aid. And Japan, even before the war, was supporting Ukraine. Now, Japan has helped the energy sector recover. It's contributing armaments through the NATO Trust Fund. That's interesting, probably drives Putin crazy. And it's actually supplied from the Japanese stocks, military stocks, 100 vehicles and a lot of emergency food and rations. So Wang Yi has noticed this, and I've introduced Wang to you. He's the head diplomat in the Communist Party. He's not the Secretary of State, who is part of the government, but he has more say. And he did something really interesting. He says the Westerners, he played a race card. He said Westerners are incapable of distinguishing between Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese. And we've had discussions even in our group about this phenomenon. But he goes on and he says, no matter how yellow you dye your hair or how sharp you can make your nose, I guess with cosmetic surgery, you'll never turn into a Westerner. Wow. that is pretty interesting. And he is making an appeal to Japan and Korea. He can see what Japan's doing now and how strong South Korea is. And he's, I think, making a rather desperate attempt to appeal for racial unity, to join hands and revitalize East Asia. Well, I mean, this is another reason why I'd like to take a deep dive into Japanese and Chinese history, particularly the conflicts that they've fought. But there was a period when Japan emerged, the Meiji, what is it? Restoration, the Meiji Restoration. What that referred to was, for once, the emperor was flexing his muscle after the fall of centuries of shogun rule. So that's what Meiji Restoration means. And how quickly they industrialized, and everybody in Asia was proud of Japan. And they were especially proud of when Japan defeated Russia in the 1905. So it's interesting that he is maybe looking back to that period where Asia was proud of East Asian accomplishment and wants to reboot that. Interesting thing, though, as hard as China may try, right now, you can just go all around the map. And I might want to do that if we decide to take a deeper dive into China and Japan. Obviously, China and Japan have big problems, always have had, especially during World War II. But China has 14 neighbors all the way around. And I welcome the opportunity to just go around the clock and tick off all the problems that exist. Right now, I'll satisfy myself with this map. The red are the fragile and failing states. The blue, not many of them, are friendly, neutral. And then there's the frenemies, like Mongolia. There's an outer and an inner Mongolia, and inner Mongolia is not being treated well. And then in yellow are the frank foes, especially, the Philippines have been fighting over the East China Sea. Vietnam and China have been to war within the last 50 years. Afghanistan with the Taliban is obviously a country that is not sympathetic to what they're doing with the Uyghurs to try to beat Islam out of the Uyghurs. So they may be appealing to the global South, but they've got problems in their own neighborhood, and that this just I failed to mention India, where they've had border fights with deaths, 20 people dying in 14,000 feet on the Himalayan border. That one of our early members, Irene, is familiar with the province of Indian where that took place, Lagan. And then overlapping maritime complaints. And then finally, Taiwan. And I needn't say any more about that. So the question is, are the Japanese back to being China's biggest a foreign threat, like they were in World War II. And I'd love the opportunity to go over this map, which shows that after the Meiji Restoration managed industrialization of Japan, what that meant, and how Japan expanded their sphere of influence. And certainly during World War II, it went all the way down to Burma and Indonesia. We've been in the palace of the Sultan on this island of Indonesia, and seen how well the Japanese were welcomed around the onset of World War II. So I talked earlier about Asians being proud of the Japanese for defeating the Russians. Well, that extended to this Sultan in Indonesia. So there's a lot more to say about that, the Philippines. And the first step, though, was to take over Okinawa. And the second step was to take over Taiwan, which was just a few years behind taking over Okinawa. So Japan has a long history in Taiwan, and certainly in the last 200 years more, Japan's been more in control of Taiwan than China has. After World War II, though, as we all know, Japan made one of the world's strongest commitments to pacifism. And it wasn't like they voted on it. It was like we were there and helped them write their constitution, and which committed them to pacifism. It's in their constitution, Article 9. And this is the wording of that. I won't go through it, but renouncing the use of force completely, ever since 1949. Now, that was a red line until this guy, Abe Shinzo, came to power. And he started talking about the possibility of renouncing pacifism. And so he reinterpreted the meaning of that phrase in the Constitution. He never submitted it to a vote. It was his cabinet that issued a statement. We renounce it. So they weren't able to change the Constitution because it was so controversial. And he at least got people to start thinking. In 2014, does Japan want to stand by in the face of Xi? Now, Xi Jinping had been in power for a couple of years, and was beginning to make more nationalistic statements. But more importantly, you've had the Kim family in North Korea flying missiles over Japan, right? And Abe Shinzo said, hey, look, everybody's got a right to self-defense. If we've got allies, if one of our allies were to be attacked, we have the right to collective security, to collective self-defense, to join in, even if Japan's not attacked directly. And that's the move that they made in 2014. But they were responding to Xi, but what was Xi responding to? So I'm kind of going backwards in history. I'd like to go back and start earlier and come forward. But Xi was responding to something that happened around 15 years before he came to power. It was that China, their GNP, had surpassed Japan. And the interesting thing in this history is how much Japan helped China industrialize, and how much goodwill there was in Japan, who was feeling a little guilty about things like Nanjing. So as soon as Deng Xiaoping shook off the Cultural Revolution and touted capitalism, Japan was on board with helping him. Deng Xiaoping made a memorable visit to Japan, the first time that Japan had anybody from China visit. And he went specifically to Panasonic and said, "How did you do this?" And the guys at Panasonic said, "Well, we'll show you." And they did. And so things were going pretty well in the relations between Japan and China, because it was based on commercial and business interests, and it made sense for both of them to do that. But then China surpassed Japan, and that changed the mentality in both countries. It made China maybe stick out its chest a little bit more, and Japan feel a little bit more defensive. I remember this. Japan decided that they would rewrite their school books and tone down the guilt and maybe take the Nanjing atrocities out of their school books. And that was around 2005. Specifically, they were whitewashing a lot of the atrocities. We were in Japan traveling, and I always went to the graphics section because I can't read Japanese, right? And I stumbled across a revisionist history comic book, a manga, and thumbed through it, and I got the drift. And the way MacArthur was depicted graphically as just an evil monster, the way Nanjing was depicted, just a total misrepresentation. And I thought about trying to retrieve that graphic depiction for today, but I didn't have enough time. But I'd be glad to try to retrieve it for some future meeting. So the question is, does this deserve a deeper dive? So the other big problem is this Yasukuni shrine. It's a shrine to the war dead, and it includes a lot of convicted Japanese war criminals. They're given a slot in this shrine. And in 2005, this guy, Koizumi Yunichiro, we've been taught now to reverse and put the last name first and the first name last, because that's the Asian tradition. That's just been adopted in the last few years. He was prime minister, and he made an official visit to that shrine. Now, he doesn't look like the kind of guy that would do it, right? When he traveled to the United States, he went to Memphis and following Elvis's path. he was a great fan. But he opened Pandora's box. Abe Shinzo set a 2020 deadline for formally changing the Constitution. but he had to retire early because he was having health problems. And in the last year, he was assassinated by a religious nut. He wanted to get this formally revoked as the provocations from North Korea continued. And he wanted to be able to be more flexible in the response, a military response that Japan could make for any provocations. This is a military self-defense drill, anticipating the day when they can be more active. And formally in December, so 6 months ago, formally, Japan changed its pacifist stance more officially. And why? Because of Ukraine. And there's still a lot of people who are holding on to the pacifist tradition. That's for sure. But all this now is on the front burner in Japan to change their constitution. And the current government, Kishido, he has led an unprecedented level of economic sanctions against other countries, in this case, obviously, Russia. Joining the West. Japan is solidly in the Western camp, no matter what Wang Yi wants them to do. And by the way, with Russia on their back foot, Japan found they had a bargaining position for a lingering beef that they have with Russia's post-World War II policy. Post-World War II, Russia took control of the Kuril Islands, which Japan had controlled since 1876, right after the Meiji Restoration. And Japan wants them back because right now, the people living there are stateless. Russia hasn't been interested enough to do anything with it. In summary, China's behavior is alarming its neighbors. We might go around that map again and give more detail. In particular, Laos, where Aiko and I have traveled with Ramsey, in lieu of that, in December, as part of their vow to double down and change the constitution, they pledged to double their defense spending. Japan did. Develop that counterstrike capability, look with an eye on North Korea, and coordinate defense more closely with America, including over Taiwan, the country where they started controlling it in the 1880s. And cooperating more with the frenemies around China that are wary of China. Now there's protests to that too, and there's a strong history of pacifism, and here they're portraying Abe as Hitler. But Russia had a reaction to that. When Russia saw what Japan was trying to do to use leverage at this moment of vulnerability, they put in a new missile system along the southern Kuril Islands facing Japan. They call the Kurils their southern islands. Of course, the Japanese call them their northern territories. The other point I want to make with Japan, and we talked about that briefly last week, is they've joined the Quad. Another thing that kind of upsets China is they're getting surrounded. And here we're talking about the big boys. We're talking about India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Always the Quad is responding to China's provocations over Taiwan and North Korea. So public opinion in Japan has swung to 90% are in favor of amending that Article 9, or I guess 51. And the security alliance with America is 90%. And they've committed to spending 2% of their budget on the military. It's now around 1%. It means that they'll have the second largest military budget by 19 or third largest, I guess, by 1927. No, I think the second largest. And they're even talking about expanding the ties that they have now with NATO. Now they're an observer. And the Japanese prime minister has attended NATO meetings for the first time in history, but as an observer. And they're aiming to be a superpower in Asia once again, a stark change from their history. And the United States has more soldiers in Japan than they do any place else. China had hoped that Kishida would relieve the pressure that Abe Shinzo had put on him because he had a reputation as a dove, but he didn't deliver. He has endorsed the move to increasing Japan's military prowess. Time featured that as pretty highly as a world issue, Japan's choice, and they've made their choice. Kishida is pushing to revive the constitution as hard as Abe Shinzo. And this is the statistic. By 2027, Japan's military budget will be second only to the United States and China's. So the other T's, and this is where I'll end, I've recommended the Drum Tower, a weekly podcast, and they just started a new series. Last week, they explored the history of the ties between Japan and China. So my enthusiasm for this is not totally original. And today, the one that just dropped, they want to show how they, among the West, they were very early in recognizing that she was a nationalist. So when when Obama was making nice with Xi, they were telling him, no, you don't want to, this is not going to work out well for you. And Japan believes that in their proximity to China, they have something to teach us. So we're at a turning point. I think the history of war between China and Japan, which goes back to the 3rd century, would be an interesting one. And so you've had a couple of thousand years of interdependence and autonomy, mutual respect, and a lot in common. Like Buddhism came to Japan from China, a lot of the culture. Obviously, kanji, language, but also suspicion, especially from the age of the shoguns, and then the Mongols. They had a dynasty in there, and for the first time in history, Japan was subject to an invasion in 1290, if I'm not mistaken. And the only reason the Mongols didn't take over Japan was because of a surprise tempest. In Japan, it was called the divine wind, the wind that came and blew the Mongol ships back. And translating that into Japanese is kamikaze. Kama being gods, and I guess kazi being wind. So, what's that?
Kaze is wind. Kami is God.
Oh, thank you for the correction. Anyway, if I would do the history, I would combine it to the history of war and violence. I wouldn't try to do, obviously, the whole history would be way too complicated. So, can California wait again, is my question. All right, comments, questions?
Does Asia have a NATO?
Well, ASEAN.
But that's economic.
That's more economic.
Yeah. Do they have a military NATO-like thing?
I'll tell you next week. I don't know. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
Seeing Ukraine being invaded like that, they probably don't want China to do the same thing, especially since they're cozying up to Russia.
Yeah, Shigeko, you raised your hand. Aiko didn't raise her hand. Aiko just barged right in.
I was wondering, why doesn't Japan organize sort of like a NATO in Asia, and include the Philippines and Taiwan?
Well, that might be an expansion of the Quad. That might be expansion of the Quad. I don't know.
I think including Taiwan in a NATO-like organization would be a real red flag.
Yeah.
Very dangerous thing to do. Wow. We have our hands full in Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, John, just a comment. Did you say that you were in Sultan of Brunei's compound?
It wasn't the Sultan of Brunei. It was Yogyakarta, which is on.
Okay. You were in Indonesia, on the Indonesian side.
Yeah, in the Sultan in Yogyakarta. And the palace there was really interesting, right? Because the Dutch took charge of Indonesia first. Right. And so you had pictures of the Sultan going and crewing on a boat in Holland. And then you had pictures of his son welcoming the Japanese as they rolled in and threw the Dutch out. And then you had a picture of a closer relative welcoming Sukarno when he came. It was a fascinating museum.
I was just curious that on the Malaysian side of Borneo, boy, they did not like having the Japanese occupation. They just they were one of the biggest things was that they didn't like the Japanese made them stand in line at the post office, and so if anything, versus just elbowing your way in, and so that, and of course the Japanese, you can never look at a Japanese soldier in the eye, and so I mean there's really a very interesting a little documentary. I think it was shown on PBS years ago. It was called the Headhunters, and the Airmen and the Headhunters, and it was about they used to have bombing runs out of New Guinea, the Americans that would come in over Brunei because that's where the oil was, and then one of the planes got shot down, and so it was all about the indigenous people and how they basically maneuvered around so they could keep the Japanese were out looking for them, but the indigenous people were doing everything they could to keep them hidden. So very interesting.
Yeah, you know, so Japanese occupation, Jeannie's in with us today, and they lived in Guam for quite a few years, and they've adopted some kids from Micronesia. When we visited Micronesia, we went to Ponape, and we noticed when we landed that there was a huge oil generating system, just ugly and polluting. And then when we went up the middle of the island on a hike, we saw all these dams, and we said, "What are these?" And our local guide said, "Oh, the Japanese came in, and we were all on hydropower when the Japanese came in, and they made us build the hydropower. They disciplined us, and looking back on it, it was better." So, oh, really? Okay. So the odd connections that you get in your travels. Jeannie, I don't know if you have any stories like that. Yeah, Homer. Oh, Homer was waving goodbye.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to run too.
Okay, and I think I've got a restless local audience as well. So, we'll end it there. Okay,
Thanks, John.
Thank you all.
Thank
Great.
you, John.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Wonderful.